Awesome. Well, we are super excited today to have Jack Naglieri, the founder and CEO of Panther Labs, on our podcast today. And for those who are new to the podcast, this is the open source startup podcast where we talk to founders of successful projects turned companies. And today we are super excited to talk to Jack about his company, Panther Labs. So Panther raised last year at a unicorn valuation, 1.4 billion, and it's a security monitoring platform. And Jack's early story, which we'll hear a lot more about, is his journey from Airbnb, building out a project, and then starting a company around it. So welcome, Jack.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
Of course. So it'd be awesome to start with the early founding story. So where did the idea for Panther come from?
So the idea for Panther came from my career just broadly. So I started in incident response and digital forensics back at Yahoo in the early 2010s, and spent about 4 years doing that at a very, very high scale and having a lot of issues doing it, to be honest, just because there really weren't a lot of tools in the market that could really support a scale like Yahoo. You can probably imagine, a company that has like billions of users and had just been around for over 18 years when I was there, just had such a massive technical footprint. And if you think about the job of security operations, it's to understand all the things going on within that footprint. So it gets really challenging at that scale. And I had the benefit of being able to learn from some of the smartest people that I'd worked with in Silicon Valley, out at Yahoo on the operations front. They had created such a really incredible set of deployments and just mechanisms of getting code out, and their DevOps team was just awesome. So I learned a ton from them on deploying security tools, because I needed to get instrumentation and understand everything happening. So that experience taught me a ton about high scale monitoring, high scale security operations, and things like that, which took me to Airbnb, which was this really huge shift in my career because Airbnb was fully cloud native. They were built in AWS. They were the generation after Yahoo, right? You have like the Yahoos and the Googles sort of coming up in like the late 90s, early 2000s. And then the next wave of big tech companies, the Airbnbs, the Stripes, the Pinterests, like things like that, that were all built in the cloud. So the challenge there was, how do we take these same concepts that we're used to in these traditional environments and apply it into the cloud? And that's exactly what I had to do at Airbnb. So eventually that led down this path of using AWS services to do security monitoring. And the way we ended up doing that was by using tools like AWS Lambda and these serverless stacks to create this sort of serverless data analysis framework, which is what we called it. And we open sourced it. It was a project called Stream Alert. And that became very popular in the security industry, in the security community, I should say. And that really led to me starting Panther. So Panther was the natural sort of evolution of what Stream Alert started, which was using serverless, using Python for doing detection as code, and just having a more elastic, scalable platform that we can sort of build off of and do things like automation and CI/CD and just these more mature, like developer-oriented workflows and apply them to security. And that was really the precursor for what I wanted to do with Panther, which is the continuation of that same idea, but just like working on it full time. Because as an engineer within a company, it's a part-time job. It's, half of my job is, can I deploy the tools and get it out there to get my data? The other half of the job is, can I respond to things that are going on? And that takes away from the core idea of like building this thing. And we were seeing that there were a lot of other companies getting a ton of value out of it. And we just, or I should say just me, I guess, because I started it myself. But I decided to leave the company in 2018 and just work on it full time. So I left in 2018 around in August, and then just started working on Panther. And then we raised some money in 2018, 2019, 2020, 2021, like once per year so far. And then, as you just mentioned, we just raised at our unicorn valuation, 1.4 billion. And it's just been such a wild journey. So would be happy to spend the next remainder time of the podcast just talking through that and how open source played a role. But that's more or less the founding story of how things got started.
So can you talk you through a bit 2017, 2018, especially when you just announced Stream Alert, right? There's a reason why Airbnb and you spent all this energy building this in the first place. Because what was not working in the industry and what forced or made a decision to build your own?
Yeah.
And second of all, you also open sourced it. And part of the 2017 blog post, there's also a mention of trying to crowdsource alerts, right? And so trying to talk about like what's the motivation of open sourcing, not just the code. Sounds like you want to actually build a community around this as well.
So I'll answer both those questions. So the first problem we were solving was the operational overhead with doing security operations at scale. A lot of it comes down to needing to just take in a huge amount of data and analyze that data and then store it for forensic purposes. And at the end of the day, this comes down to building really intense data infrastructure. And in addition to just other mechanisms of doing analysis and security related activities. So the first problem with that was the tools that existed in the market, one, were actually never designed for that purpose. All the traditional so-and-so SIEMs, like security info and event management systems, really weren't technologically sophisticated and really weren't used. A lot of people they don't have any confidence in them just because they were never able to handle any material scale. They were very false positive prone, and they were very hard to sort of customize and manage. So a lot of people in the industry just gravitated towards tools like Splunk, Elastic, and other things that were more moldable and did better at scale and were used by ops teams in a more stable way. So what happened was the security industry molded those into SIEMs, but then eventually they hit their scale limits as well. And we were kind of back to square one. So the reason that we built StreamAlert was because we wanted something that would operate at a very high scale with a very small amount of effort. So serverless enabled that fully because we were able to just feed more data into it, and the Amazon service would just elastically handle it. And we didn't really have to do too much. It doesn't mean that it's a silver bullet because your code still at the end of the day has to be well architected. But this is still a much better base to build off of versus dealing with virtual machines and load balancing and just these more operational and DevOps concepts that security teams just historically don't have. So ops was the first thing. The second thing was we wanted a better, more flexible, more expressible way to do detection. And these SIM tools either didn't give you the mechanism at all to do this. They would just have the built-in detections that you'd have to work with. And then the log analytics tools like the Splunks, Elastics, et cetera, have a domain-specific language, which isn't a full programming language. It's kind of a in-between. And it's similar to using like a bash script or something like that, right? Even though actually bash is probably more expressive than what you'd get out of Splunk or Elastic, but you were very limited in your ability to really do analysis in a way that was more expressive, testable, clever, et cetera. So what would end up happening is anything complex would just be this huge blob of like very ugly search language that was really hard to sort of understand and really be useful. So we wanted programming languages. We were just like, we want to use Python. Security people have used Python forever. It's very, very common. So we took this concept of streaming. So data would come in. We would use AWS Lambda as our mechanism of normalizing the data, which is also a concept I introduced into StreamAlert because data has to be structured in order for this to work, but it also has to be structured in order for it to be searchable in a data warehouse at scale too. Like this is the goal, right? So the operational burden is taken care of. And now we have the power of Python to our disposal. And then the last thing that we started building in was storage into a serverless data lake effectively. And that also enabled scale in taking in all this data and really storing it for a long period of time because retention was another huge problem that we had in SIEMs. So those are the three sort of like big bucketed reasons and then technical explanations as to why we did those things. And the thing that's really crazy is that all three of those things are extremely hard to do. No one has really been successful at scale, in my opinion, until Panther. And that's really been enabled by the shift that we saw in the industry around serverless data warehouses like Snowflake, for example, serverless services like AWS Lambda and Kinesis and SQS and all these other things. And we've just seen everything kind of move up the stack a little bit. And as security people, we can take advantage of that to operate at scale, to protect our environments and to really have strong security outcomes. So that was the reasoning behind like why we did it. And then the open source angle is really interesting too. So security has a very big open source community. A lot of the biggest security tools ever, like network monitoring, host monitoring. Like if I use like OS Query as an example, if I use like Bro and Suricata as examples, like these are all like really great open source projects in security that are widely used to protect a lot of organizations in the world. So we wanted to do something for the security community as well. So we built this project, made it open source, and then shared it out. And then we noticed that hundreds of organizations were starting to use it at very high scales. So that was an indicator to me that like, okay, there's truly a need in the market. This isn't just us like, saying we're going to build our own thing because, it's always a tricky decision to decide to build something versus just buying it. But we really truly felt that the tools in the industry had failed us, and this was our first way out of that. So open source was, again, just a way to give back to the security community, get some other different environments and get people using it in all these different ways and learn from those experiences and make the tool overall better for everybody. Also, I'll give credit. I have to obviously give credit to my manager at the time, who was also the same manager who created OS Query. So he came from Facebook. And then when he started the Airbnb team, he hired me into the team, and we built Streamalert together. So he has roots in open source, and that was also a big reason why we ended up doing it. And the project became quite successful. I mean, there was a huge backing, obviously, from Airbnb being the company that puts it out, and Airbnb is a really great engineering team. So they have a lot of other great tools they've open sourced as well, related to DevOps, security, et cetera. So. And there was actually others that we did while at Airbnb, like Binary Alert was another one. I believe they've actually open sourced some other tools too, which is really cool. So open source was a really great lever for us, just to meet other people in the community, to help them use our tool, and some really big Silicon Valley companies were using it too. And I won't go into who, but it was really an awesome way for us to meet that community and help them out as well. So.
I'd love to dig a bit more on this moment of project market fit and when you knew that there was really something there, because to your point, the quality of who's using the project and the use cases they're using it for and the scale that they're using it at matters a lot to really know if there's enough there to then go out and build a company around it. So were there certain things you were looking for, or a moment where you said, okay, we have enough users around these use cases are using it at this scale that we really think there's something here?
It wasn't that well thought out, to be honest. I think for me, I always had a motivation to be an entrepreneur and to build something. And I've always loved the idea of building just anything. That's why I was really excited to even build Streamalert, because it was a project that I could just kind of mold with my hands and create, and people would get value out of it. And that brought me a lot of happiness. So I think for me, it was being able to take that and just build it into something even bigger, build a company around it. And we had seen so many companies using it. We had had success at Airbnb with it, and it was just a huge opportunity for us. So I didn't have entrepreneurial training. I didn't have a business background. I didn't go to Stanford, like graduate school of business. I don't have the typical like entrepreneur resume. I don't even have the typical like software engineer resume, to be honest, but here we are. And I think that was really just the motivation, is wanting to build something a little bit bigger and take this project that was being adopted by a lot of different companies and just really turn it into something that's like even more impactful and even more useful to security teams. Because I'd felt that pain myself for so many years, and it just felt like something I could do to bring more value into the community. So.
And so when you started the project, right, saw the growth and saw the opportunity, what was really some of the biggest factors for you? Because beyond just, okay, this is an opportunity to actually create a company, there's obviously still a lot of questions, right? Hey, what kind of companies will build what kind of alerts? Will you use Amazon's? Will everybody use the Amazon Lambda? Will they trust our data? There's always actually a lot of factors that I see can actually make this into a successful company. What was the exploration like? What were kind of not just the signs, but also things you kind of have to figure out? Okay, this is actually not just a good idea, but we actually seeing a lot more, I think, signals that this actually could be turn out to be a very large product that everyone needs.
Yeah. So we already knew that the problem was validated. So in that sense, we knew what we should build. And typically in startups, that's one of the hardest things to figure out is what are we going to build that's going to bring value? Because I had spent several years doing that, I already had a good idea of what people were getting value out of. And a lot of it goes back to the elements I talk about now with Panther, which is speed, scale, and flexibility. Like those are the things that security teams need. We need to detect things very quickly. We need to be able to respond to things very quickly. We need a very flexible way to define the types of behaviors we want to identify. And we just need to operate at a huge scale. So, those are really the elements that go into a platform that we need to build. And we knew that that's what we had to do. So there's a lot of decisions though, before you can get your first customer. The first one is what's the desired outcome we want with our product? Like what's the problem that we're solving? Like define that very clearly. And then the second thing from that is like, which cohort of the market are we going to go after? And oftentimes the problem statement kind of leads into the second part of like, okay, if you know what you're going to build and why you're going to build it, it's very easy to also just say like, who would be a good first customer, or like, what's the prototype or archetype of a company or a user that would be successful in this? And for us, it was really engineers. That was really what my persona was. And in a lot of ways, I was like, how would I sell this to myself when I was back at Airbnb? So that kind of eventually led to us doing the open source as well for that same reason. So we knew that we just need to get customers. And in the early days, that's really what you need to prove. Do you have a product that's solving a need? Do you have product market fit? Right. And I think it was really interesting, Amanda, you said project market fit, and I've never heard it referenced like that, but it's a very interesting way to consider it, just given that open source has that fit in the market too. But open source repos are projects, not products in a lot of ways sometimes, right? It's not that well thought out most of the time. It's serving a need, but it's not this like, it's not a process where we're going through and really thinking about the end user. We're more of like, we're going to build something cool, technical, that's useful. And that's what open source has been for a lot of people. And of course, there's a wide range of that, right? Like there's some projects that are extremely stable, well thought out and things like that. But it's also probably because there's companies behind them, right? Docker is a good example of that, or like Kubernetes is a good example of that. Like these projects have just been well thought out by a lot of big companies for many years. But in the early days, like that's what you have to get to. It's, do you have a product that is solving a need in the market, and are people willing to pay for it? And that's literally the only thing that matters. If you can say yes to that, then you'll have some level of success as a company. And getting to that is the hardest thing. 0 to 1 is very uncertain, very difficult, and you don't have a lot of time to figure it out. And you have to get people as well. So the 3 elements are product, team, and market, right? If you read any of Mark Andreessen's like old archived like blog posts, like that's a lot of the way I think about it still today, is those 3 elements. And those 3 elements are the levers that you have to really get right to build a business that's going to be sustainable. So.
Yeah, this definition of product market fit in the open source space is something that we spend a lot of time talking to guests about, because you could have a project that's widely adopted, but nobody's willing to pay for it, or your users aren't the ones that would have enough budget to pay for it. So on that note, let's shift a little bit and talk about StreamAlert versus Panther, and then move into, because there's a lot of questions that we have around Panther and the decision to close source, but maybe let's start by just setting the table and saying what the difference between those two are.
Well, there's a lot of similarities in their in the thought of the projects, primarily because I built both of them. So like one was really the precursor to the next one, but I'd say Panther is several generations ahead of what StreamAlert is. That project was like the V1 of this idea of, can we use serverless to do security operations? So I'd say the biggest fundamental difference is that Panther is designed around a user interface. StreamAlert is fully command line. And I'm pretty sure that hasn't changed. But to be honest, I haven't been as pertinent to that project, just because running a company, it's busy. But that was the biggest difference. And I would say the next biggest difference is Panther's like chosen language for backend services and things like that. Like, and I typically wouldn't get this technical of a explanation, but we decided to rewrite basically everything from scratch because while at Airbnb, saw a lot of the scale limits of Streamalert, and a lot of it was just architectural. Like I said, like serverless is great and it helps you elastically scale, but it's not a silver bullet for performance. There's still a lot of considerations you have to do, and you still have to have a very well architected system that can handle scale. So the scales we've been able to achieve in Panther are like mind blowing to me. Like we've been able to process like over 50 terabytes of data per day through it. And that's like really insane to me. And we were never able to achieve that in Streamalert. And a lot of that just goes back to the fundamental architectural differences. So the essence is the same, where we're using serverless and we're doing data analysis in a real time or near real time way. But Panther is just the way more mature version of that. It's also designed around a UI and all these different UX workflows. And like we have whole teams of people who are just dedicated to those major components of the product I was referring to before, which is data ingested into the product, data analyzed, alerts sent, and then investigation. So we have teams based on all these things. And then we have a platform team that helps run our SaaS. So that's the next biggest difference, is that Panther's fully hosted. And then another huge difference is that Panther's backed by Snowflake, which again gives us huge amounts of performance gain over AWS Athena, which was what Streamalert was based off of. So there's a lot of things where we tried the concept for the first time in Streamalert, and then in Panther, it's like, and then I hired a whole team to make it really, really good. I hired some early engineers from Amazon as well, who had built similar systems at their company, and they were doing security monitoring at a mind-blowing scale. I mean, Amazon's, probably has the biggest cloud footprint in the world. And the team that had to do security monitoring there just had such unique learnings that we were able to bring into our platform. And it's really just a combination of all these great minds kind of coming together and all these great experiences going into building our platform. And, there's still a lot that we need to do. We're by no means done. It's always going to be an evolving thing, and there's always going to be ways to make it better. And that's the thing that I'm most excited about by running a company, is we have this opportunity to truly just hire a huge amount of people just to focus on every part of the product. And that's a really exciting element that really makes me really happy. Because the more we solidify a lot of these workflows and the better we make the product, the more successful our security teams that we support will be. And that's ultimately the goal here. So those are the biggest fundamental differences on a macro level. It's, taking those concepts that worked and keeping them, but also just making them super mature and bulletproof. And that's really the big difference you're getting. You're getting an enterprise tool. You're not getting an open source project that you have to manage yourself. And I think that goes a very long way in helping security teams remove the burden of operations, which is maybe a segue into why we closed sourced. So I can just talk about that. So initially, let me back up. So 2018 is when I started. We made a couple first hires, and then 2019 we just spent building. We raised a seed round to keep building, and then in 2020 in January I open sourced. And we didn't really announce the open source until March, because that was our V1. And we did a Hacker News thing. It, got us 350 stars, whatever, it was just a quick start. And in June is when we started to first get our first customers. And in a lot of ways, open source was the catalyst to at least a handful of our first customers. I can't say it was the catalyst to all of them, but I could say confidently that it did lead to our first couple of customers. And I don't know if we would have gotten those first customers if we didn't open source. So it's funny to look back and be well, you closed source, why'd you do that? And, I'll tell you why. But, the first year, 2020 was 2020 to me was truly the first year that Panther really became a company, in my opinion. 2018, 2019, we were just trying to figure out what to do. We had some validation from Streamalert, but we still weren't quite sure what we needed to build a business. It's a very different thing, as you know. So we finally figured out that, people want to do the same sorts of things that we're doing in Stream Alert. We added a couple of other features around cloud security, vulnerability scanning, and things like that to just give more quick value into the product. But we ended up open sourcing something that allowed people to write Python-based detections in the UI, push them out to their streaming logs, and then have a very rudimentary way to search data in a data lake using Athena. That was our V1 as well, because this was before we partnered with Snowflake, which happened later in the year. So 2020 was, again, still a year of experimentation. We were still unsure if we had a business. And then on my birthday, funny enough, we got our first 2 customers. And that was really exciting because we were like, okay, cool. Someone's willing to pay us for this. And what we offered was, it was effectively a commercial open source business model. So you could get Panther open sourced and it had some of the features, and then you buy the Panther Enterprise and it has the historical search element. It has the quote unquote enterprise ready features like SSO, et cetera. Right. At that time we had maybe 2 of those things. It was just so basic, and we just need something to sell. And then we were also selling a SaaS hosted solution as well. So those were sort of delineations of what was free and what was not free. And then we went through 2020, we got our first 10 customers, some really great companies as well. And then I kind of took a look at the year and I was like, okay, we got 10 customers. Where do they all come from? How did we actually end up signing them? And I think it ended up being 2 of them came from open source. And the reason I was even doing this was because I noticed that our engineering team was spending a huge amount of time and effort just maintaining an open source project and a closed source project. Because at the end of the day, we still had our internal enterprise version, which a lot of commercial open source companies have. And I pinged a lot of other founders who did commercial open source models like Teleport, for example, Mattermost also. And these are portfolio companies to S28 Capital, which was the fund that actually helped me start Panther. And I talked to them and I was like, how do you guys do it? What's the dynamic? And it's just very overly complicated, to be honest. And it adds a huge amount of overhead into the engineering team. And I looked back and I was like, well, most of our customers aren't coming from here. And the project is growing, but there's not a huge amount of contributors. It's really just us building it and putting it out there. And we weren't really seeing the benefits of it being open source. In addition to, we weren't seeing contributions. So it wasn't this huge thriving community like you would expect from a Docker or a tool that's just very small and very valuable in that sense, like a CI/CD tool, for example, that does vulnerability scans. That's a very contained thing that can run in CI, and it's very easy to contribute and wrap your head around. But a platform that's doing security operations, there's so many components to it. It's very difficult to just grasp your head around the concepts. So we didn't even think it's really a great candidate for open source. We were using open source as a way to get it to our potential customers very quickly. We wanted people to get value from it immediately and then be able to say oh, cool. Well, if I want to, buy into their SaaS and get, more support and, just really make this a mature deployment, then I'll go buy Panther. But I just made the decision. I was like, well, if we really want to build a business to where we can truly support security teams, we can build a super mature product that is just even more even higher quality than it is today. We need to close source. And we made the decision about a year later. Actually, I made the decision in January of 2021, and then we announced it in about April, I think, March or April. And then that was it. Yeah. And it's so hard to believe that was less than a year ago, to be honest. It's like dog years in a startup. You're just oh my God, things change so quickly. But I don't regret that decision at all. I think it was the right decision for us as a project and as a company. And it really did benefit our engineering function a lot by just being able to move faster, being more focused on what we were doing, why we were doing it. And, things will continue to evolve. But because we closed sourced the platform, it doesn't mean that we closed sourced everything. So we still have a lot of things that are open source. We have a Panther analysis tool, which is our command line tool that helps people push things into Panther programmatically. It allows you to do testing of the detections locally or in CI/CD. We also have a lot of our detections as open source. Actually, I think all of them are open source. And we still rely on people to, contribute things back there. Our customers specifically, if they find something, they can just push it back. But again, security teams are really strapped for time. They're really strapped for resources. And in a lot of ways, open source goes against those ideas. So if you think about a team that does not have the time to invest into deploying a tool and nurturing it over time, like it's very unlikely that they'll be successful with it at scale. So this idea of pulling and leaning into SaaS and leaning into doing more for your customers is really what's been on my mind in the last like couple of years. And I think ultimately that's what security teams need the most. They just need to focus on security and not on like operations, deployment, updates, like a lot of these things that come with having to deploy open source, and just an inordinate amount of time learning about the project, learning the ins and outs of it. But sometimes that's the benefit of open source, because if you have those savvy engineers, like I was the same way. I used to use Chef all the time, and I could be like, I don't know why I'm having this issue. I'm going to go look at the code and actually see what it's doing. And I'm like, oh, okay. So this is actually a limitation. Like they're presenting this interface to me, but in reality, it's actually doing this. And those things are really helpful to understand from open source projects. So there's totally a benefit of that. But when the project is very complicated, like Kubernetes, for example, and all I need to know is how do I just deploy this thing to run my application, the technical barrier can be really high, or the technical threshold to be successful can be very high. So it's like, I would even argue that a tool like Kubernetes like doesn't get the benefit of being open source for like at least 50% of its users, maybe more, because they're not at the end of the day going to go dive into the code because they don't have time and they don't have the technical expertise. So it's like, there's always that trade-off. But there's a lot of tools that just benefit from being open source for the reason of being able to easily contribute back to it, to really like benefit from understanding the underlying code of what it's doing. And also for trust, like at the end of the day, like we want to put something out there that we feel good about. And the whole idea with open source, maybe it's not a very true idea, but people tend to think, oh, if I put my code open source, it's going to be higher quality, but that's not always the case, right? It's a trust thing though, because you're like, this is exactly what I'm doing. And if you're concerned about privacy, you can be like, literally all the code's in the open, like go look at it. Like we're not doing anything. So there's a lot of things that are great about open source, and a lot of the start of my career is based in open source. So I still have a love for it, but when I think about building a business that's going to be sustainable over time, it's just, there's a lot of disadvantages with open source, especially in security, because it goes back to like not wanting to burden people with operations. And in the event of an incident, like the last thing you need is like, oh my God, how do I scale this thing? Like, oh my God, I need to update it because I don't have this feature. It's just like, we just need to wipe that away from anyone's mind. Like it shouldn't even be a thing people worry about, in my opinion. So again, our goal is to reduce the amount of the biggest amount of friction as possible and solve those challenges around operations, around flexibility, around, just having the confidence to take in as much data as you need to do your security jobs. So that's some context really around why we went closed source and what our journey was like there.
So we wanted to touch on the how as well, on how you close source, because in addition to it being a good way for folks to find out about a project and it be a good kind of piece of go to market, there's also a lot of awesome support that comes from having an open source project. And so I'd love to know how you thought about making sure there wouldn't be any negative consequences there, or just making sure you can mitigate those. And then second question, why did you decide to keep the analysis tool open source? Because I imagine there's still some support required for that.
So before we closed source, we basically talked to everyone using the project that we knew about. And we were like, hey, giving you a heads up, we're going to close source. If you'd love to work with us and continue to work with us, like we'd be happy to give you a discount on our enterprise SaaS version or whatever. So we extended that out and just didn't want to leave them in the dark. But, naturally some people are going to be upset and you got to move on. Not everyone's going to be happy, but we did put our best foot forward there and try to prevent that from happening, right? We want as many people to be happy with the decision as possible. So that's a little bit of how we ended up doing it. We did it very slowly. It took several months. So like I said, like we started doing it in January and then announced it in like April. It just took a long time. So we wanted to make sure people were supported and okay with that. And then remind me of your second part of your question.
Why keep the analysis tool open source?
Yeah, right. I think the analysis tool is actually a great candidate for open source because it's so small, it's so contained, and it's open source because a lot of our customers use it to do CI/CD. So their processes, they have detections in their own GitHub, and they use the analysis tool and they pull it in with pip. So they'll pip install it and then they'll run it in CI. So that being open source just reduces friction. And it's a very small contained project that just benefits a lot from being open source, actually.
So let's talk about the pros and cons a bit, because you mentioned like the huge support burdens and the sort of the distraction, and the customers are really trying to, it's too much work for the customer to figure out how to run it at production, right? And operational burdens. There's also the pros, I guess, why a lot of companies still remain open source after all these years. And it's because a lot of people want the sort of distribution, or they want the users to go talk about, they want to have their own meetups and community. And, if Kubernetes is not open source, you're not going to see 1,000 conferences and meetups about it. I just wonder, is that not a priority because security space is just a little bit different, that you don't really need that much word of mouth happening? Or do you think it's just not worth it just because of all the reasons you talked about?
It's a good question. My opinion is that if you have an open source project that's thriving with this community, you can build a business on top of it. But I still fundamentally believe you're going to hit a lot of the same problems. If you look at Elastic, for example, they have, as a business, a lot of challenges with the fact that Elastic's open source. One of the challenges is that people are reluctant to pay for it because it's open source. Another challenge is that the experience of Elastic varies greatly for those people because they're effectively forced to learn how to run everything operationally themselves. And Elastic, for better or for worse, has a reputation of being unreliable for that reason, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's true. It could just mean that us as operators aren't really trained properly to get the value out of it that they designed it for. So because of inconsistencies with how people run code, it can really change the way they perceive that project for better or for worse. So to me, as a founder, it's like, I don't want people to have those experiences in Panther. I'd rather us run it for them because we're the experts. We've designed the code, we understand it, and we can remove that burden from them while keeping them on the most recent version, while again, removing operational overhead. Security is one of those things that's in high demand, just in general. Security teams are traditionally understaffed. So to force them to run open source on a critical function, to me, is an anti-pattern. So maybe it's different, right? Because ops teams, and going back to the Kubernetes project, like ops teams are a requirement for every company. And security teams are as well, but there's more ops people than security people. Security is very specialized. But if you actually look at like EKS, for example, like Elastic Kubernetes Service. Why do you think that was built? It was built because Kubernetes is hard to run, right? Like it's hard to deny the ops overhead challenge with open source. And it doesn't mean that open source is just blanket a bad thing. There's a lot of great things about open source, the transparency element, the security element, the trust element, the collaboration element, the community. Like there's a lot of awesome things that come from it. But when we think about running business critical parts of our environment, relying on open source, in my opinion, can be an anti-pattern for that. And it can result in more trouble than you get from it from gain. And it really just is going to depend on the mentality of engineering leadership at the end of the day. But I will tell you that a lot of companies I've worked in migrated from running it themselves to running Elastic services for that reason, just because they can't afford, like those pros of open source do not outweigh the operational burden that comes with it. And that's the biggest challenge that I've seen. So there's a lot of good that comes from it, especially in the community element of being able to get different people looking at it and the diversity of thought that results in that, and the community elements of being able to help each other. And like those things are great. But at the end of the day, like we're supporting businesses, and businesses have to be reliable. And like those things that are mission critical, I don't think get the true benefits of open source in all cases. So I think it really just varies. There's things that are mission critical that are like very heavy, and then there's things that are like very light, very useful, and aren't mission critical that, do benefit from open source. So it's just a trade-off.
Yeah. And it almost sounds like, at least for your use case, there were some benefits early on to open source around validating product market fit and validating that there were a lot of potential users and customers out there. Do you think for a lot of founders and a lot of open source based companies, it's good in the beginning to get some of the benefit of being able to validate a problem and the potential market and get some community adoption, but then closed source? Like, I'm trying to distill for other founders where it could benefit most often to open source and then where it can get tricky. And we've seen this with a lot of companies where they'll start off open source, but then they'll have closed source projects, closed source products on top of that. So it just doesn't seem like there's a lot of consistency. So trying to distill some advice that might be broadly applicable from your experience.
My advice broadly is just decide one way or the other. If you want to do commercial open source, go all in on it. If you're not comfortable, then just go all in on SaaS. And I'm biased now that I've gone through the journey. My thought now is like SaaS is just the way forward in general. And if you build a great SaaS that is easy to adopt, then you'll be successful. But I think honing in on the easy to adopt part is probably the key here. The one thing with open source that's very nice is that it's very low friction in the beginning, right? Not in the long term, not in the total cost of ownership. It's not. But in the beginning, if an engineer is like, oh, this looks really cool, I want to just deploy it, I don't want to talk to a salesperson, it's great for that. However, if they never talk to the salesperson, then the business is going to die, right? Like, you're never going to get those leads. They're going to be self-sufficient. That's something that I know that other commercial open source companies have dealt with, right? They have to battle with their open source community to make money and survive. And at the end of the day, they're the ones contributing over 90% to these projects. So it's this weird sort of like double-edged sword. So it's really hard. I mean, there's no right answer. You have to do whatever you can to build that early trust. And if doing open source in the beginning helps with that, like, that's great. And if you want to maintain that over time, that's also great. But it's a very non-trivial amount of work to maintain. You have to have DevRel people. You have to really dedicate resources to nurture that environment. And if you don't have that experience and you don't have the resources to do it, it's probably not going to be successful over time. So my advice is just like, be very intentional which one you're going to do. Like, if you really want to do commercial open source forever and you feel very strongly about it, then lean into it, but realize you're going to have to hire a team that's just dedicated to it. So I'm just biased now because I've gone through it. And to me, it's like SaaS is the way that we're really going to build a sustainable business, and the way that like teams really should be using our tool, in my opinion. It's the same reason that Snowflake doesn't offer like a local version. They went all in on SaaS, and they're like, if you don't want to use SaaS, that's fine. We'll see you again in 5 years when you change your mind. But we know that everyone's going this way, and you just got to catch up. So I think it's just the intentionality of it, but realizing that there's no shortcut here, right? If you want to build a business that is successful, you have to have, you have to have a good market. Obviously, you have to have a good product, and you have to have a good team. And part of that market pull is people being willing to pay for it. That's at the end of the day, the basis of your business. So
it's really amazing to hear your journey, right? From Airbnb engineer, like you mentioned, right, to jump into the founder journey, open source, and now into this full product and all the consideration and scaling the team, all those challenges, right? You mentioned some of the points already, but I'm just curious, what are the biggest learnings you have as a founder, right? When you start 2018, S28 helped you, get off the ground, right? Just tons of learning from the 0 to 1 and now the 1 to 100. What will be like one biggest learning from the 0 to 1 and one biggest learning from 1 to, all the way to 100 now that you learned?
It's really hard to answer that question in a very concise way, because there's not like one or two things where I can be like, just do this and you'll be great. I think at the end of the day, the thing that I always come back to is just continuously learning and surrounding yourself with the right people. And I think at the end of the day, if you do those things successfully, everything else flows from it. Continuous learning is very important in a startup, because the rate of change is so fast that you effectively have to reinvent the way you do things every 6 to 12 months. So continuous learning as the founder, both in your ability to be a leader, but also in the dynamics and the operational complexity of how you orchestrate your company. Like all of those things are constantly changing. So that's the first thing I say. And it's like the most abstract advice where someone's like, okay, well, now what do I do? It's like, well, you gotta just kind of get in there and start doing it. And if you focus on those three elements, product, team, and market, and you get those three right, then everything else sort of flows from that. So continuous learning, get those three elements right. And then honestly, just surround yourself with really strong people who've gone through the journey before or are domain experts in their field that you think can help build your product. So if you choose to go down the venture capital route, it's really, you're getting money, but you're getting knowledge. And at the end of the day, the thing I say the most is time is the biggest enemy of a startup. You have to move fast. You have to learn very fast. And one way you can do that is by surrounding yourself with people who are ahead of you, like quote unquote, learn from the masters, learn from people who are maybe 2 or 3 years ahead of you, or maybe even 10 years ahead of you, right? Like they went through the journey and now they're an investor. And there's a lot of things you can learn from those people. And there's a lot of things that I continually learn from those people who've gone through it before. And at the end of the day, those learnings are going to save you time. So anything you can do to save that time as a founder is extremely valuable. Reading startup books as well has been something that's been very valuable to me as a founder. And taking all of these different pieces of learnings and kind of combining them and applying them to my own journey. So recently, like I read Reed Hastings' book, No Rules Rules. Awesome book. Loved it. I read The Ride of a Lifetime, Bob Iger's book. Also such an incredible journey. I read all of the typical 0 to 1 and lean startup and all those things. But at the end of the day, like nothing prepares you for this job. And you never want to think like, oh, I read lean startup, I can be a founder. It's like, yeah, well, you're going to learn maybe 5% of what it's really like. And then you're going to get in and you're like, oh man, this wasn't in the book. I don't know what to do. Like, yeah, welcome to being a founder. You're not going to know a lot of things. And it's just it's a job of continuous learning and continuous, I almost said integration, continuous iteration, right? Like you have to always question what you're doing today and if it's the right thing at the right time. So, it's a lot of like introspection, and in a lot of ways, it's a lot of like as one VC that I spent a lot of time with last year, he phrased it, managing your own psychology. And that's a huge part of being a founder too, because it's extremely taxing on you as a human. It's extremely stressful. You're worried about life and death. And also to quote, hard thing about hard things, it's like the only two things you ever feel in a startup is extreme euphoria and extreme terror. And both of them are made worse by lack of sleep. And that's like, it's the most true sentence. And I always come back to it because I'm like, yeah, that's pretty much right. When things work, it feels amazing. When things don't work, you feel like everything's going to, crash and burn. And that's the constant up and down because there is so much uncertainty in startups. And that's why so many of them fail, because it's really hard to get those three things right. But if you wrap your head around it and say, in order for this to work, I need product, team, and market. And in order for it to work in the early days, I just need to validate really product and market. Team is really hard to get in the early days. And you really only need like 5 people to truly validate the market and the product. So it's like, get there first and then surround yourself with the right people, continuously learn, be humble, and lean on the people who are around you. Like a problem I see that founders fall into, or a trap I see some founders fall into, is that they're unwilling to hire leaders under them. They're unwilling to delegate. And you just have to do that. You have to let go. And it's a very scary thing to do as a founder, but it's necessary. And if you let go to the people who aren't able to take that role and run with it, then you have to make other hard decisions. And you have to, you have to move on from certain people, and you have to know when to let people go and when to promote people. And, there's a lot of this just comes down to like really strong people management and managing your team and leading your team and inspiring your team and defining the why and like all these other things. So at the end of the day, like the CEO job just comes down to like being inspiring, being a strong leader, being a good people manager, and bringing the domain expertise really to the table and conveying that with the why of the company. Like, why are we all here? So the job shifts over time. Like in the early days, there's like one phase, and then the next phase, there's there's a different journey. And then now it's like, the phase 3 is like, you're a public company, you have like, this whole C-suite, and, you're just trying to figure out how do we reinvest things. So I'm referencing like a lot of different public articles. But I would say just read a lot, learn a lot, try to learn as much from other people that have been successful, and take pieces of their journey and apply it to what you're doing. And hopefully it will help you solve and get through some of the problems that you're having. But the beauty is that there's a lot of successful companies. There's a ton of smart people, like so many of them out there. The Silicon Valley network is one of the most fascinating things I've ever experienced in my life, both from just the sheer amount of knowledge, but also just the sheer amount of people who are willing to help and help push you forward. And the product market fit is so real, like both from the people using your product, but also from the people who are helping support the companies coming up. There's just a really incredible community there. So to circle back to community, it's like there's open source communities, but then there's also like building company communities. And in a lot of ways, they all want the same thing, which is, they want people to succeed in solving problems that are pushing something forward. Security, operations, like whatever it is, like we all want things to get better in the world. And like, that's why we're building things. So I hope that's helpful advice for people listening. A lot of it is somewhat abstract, but I think just keeping this open mind, keeping a growth mindset, keeping a abundance mindset, like all these things are really key to survive. And the last thing I say is you should just lean into it and do it. If you're thinking about doing it, just try it. It's the worst thing that can happen is you fail and you get the experience and you go back to being a software engineer. That was basically my mentality. I was like, what's the worst that could happen? I do this for a year and it fails and I just go join another company. It's like, it's pretty low risk, and I'm sure I would gain an awesome experience along the way. And I can confidently say I've gained an exponential amount of experience and knowledge. And I've learned a lot about myself as a person, as a leader. And I've had such an incredible journey through this. So, I would urge anyone to start a company that wants to go through that very intense up and down journey, but come out on the other side of it as someone who's grown quite a lot. So.
Awesome. Well, Jack, this was fantastic. Thank you so much for doing this with us.
Yeah. Thanks so much for having me. It was a great conversation. And I have like really kind of spicy takes on open source, but I don't want you to think that like I don't like it. I think open source has really been critical in pushing forward a lot of what we know today is like modern technology, Linux is open source, There's so many great things have come from open source. So I don't want you to think that I'm like overly negative about it. I think it's just when we're trying to build a business to solve a problem, we want to just do that in a way that's going to result in the best outcome for our customers. And that's really the reasoning why we made those decisions. But, everyone's journey is different. My journey is probably going to be a lot of other people who are listening, but, just knowing that there's another side to it, right? Like, and there's always a reason why you should do things. So, love open source. Don't get me wrong, but I really appreciate the time today. Thank you so much.
Awesome.